Hello and welcome to Computer Tech and More. Today we're going to be taking a look at a bunch of more fans. So the primary open boxes are going to be the Silent Wings Pro 4, the 120 and 140 millimeter size variants. The Pros are basically have a faster RPM than the non-Pros, but otherwise they're very similar. And you can simulate the non-Pros with the dial on the back, and I'm going to have all the performance data so you can make the decision for yourself, as well as the Fractal Design, the X2GP 1B, and this is the 180 millimeter fan found in the Torrent case, and the 140 millimeter fan that's found on the bottom of the Torrent case. It is called the X2GP-14, and we're going to be taking a look at all these fans' performance values. Alright, let's start with the Silent Wings 4 Pro 120mm fan, open boxing. Opening it up. There's some product information at the top here. Let's see. Oh, that's in English and then other languages, and then some pictures of it. The packaging itself looks pretty nice. Let's open it up. Let's see what's in the accessories. The accessories have the alternative mounts for if you want it to hook up more like an airflow at the front of your case, I guess. And some mounting screws and case mounts. So these are radiator mounts, mounting screws with washers. Clumsy. Well, let's open up the fan and take a look at it. There we are. So the first thing I'm going to notice about this fan is it's very heavy. I'm not sure if that will be true of the non-Pro variant, but because this just has a higher RPM motor, it can reach up to 3000 RPM. And on the back of the fan here, it has medium, HS, high performance, and UHS, ultra high performance. So you can determine what sort of characteristics you want with the fan. For my testing, I'm going to be just using it at ultra high performance because I can adjust the RPMs, but just note that the scaling may be different. So from like 50 to 60 in ultra high performance is a different RPM range than from 50 to 60 at the M. So you'll need to determine the data, kind of read between the lines there a little bit. And let's see. So the way it's set up right now with these brackets would be good for radiators because you would get a nice seal plopped against the radiator, so all your air is going to blow through it. And let's go ahead and change one side over to these brackets. Alright, to change over the other sides, see these little indents? You push in on them, and it just kind of slides off. Note to be careful on the cable side. Looks like that one is different than the rest, so I just made my life a little bit more difficult. And yeah, that just slides right on. And bing bada boom, done. So personally I like the squared off look, but if you like the more rounded look of a fan, then these are going to be fantastic for you. Boom boom, off that comes. There we go. Fan arrow indicators. The placement of the cable is a little unique on this fan. It's very stiff, so when cable managing I would just be extra careful with it. The cable itself Feels very high quality. Actually, the plug here looks extra robust with some strain relief at the plug so that it will be less likely to break there. I don't know what else to say about it right now. I suppose we'll go to the product page. So let's go there and take a look at it there. Sorry, back to the accessories really quick. So it has these thin mount ones that I'm not really sure what they're for, and then more like standard case mounts. So not sure about these offhand right now. Now let's go to the product page. Alright, now let's open box the Silent Wings 4 Pro variant. So this is almost exactly identical to the 120. This same very nice looking packaging. Lots of, I guess, cardboard boxes in there. We have the same sort of extra mounts. And these are for the more circular look for the fan. You've got the extra radiator screws, case fan, or case screws in there. And there's that. You've got your instructions. What M, H, and U, HS and UHS performances. So for the 140, M is tops out at 1,100 RPM, HS is 1,900 RPM, and UHS is 2,400 RPM. And it has the 120, which I didn't talk about when I didn't look at that when I did the open box for the 120 millimeter version. But let's take a look at it. Again, it's a rather heavy feeling fan, especially compared to the Fractal Design 140 millimeter fan. Kind of do a quick side by side here. This is probably double the weight, and I personally think it's probably in the motor because of how much higher performance the datasheet says. Because, well, like the blades you want as light as possible, the hub you want as light as possible, so that the fan runs as efficiently as possible. Again, to remove the side frames, you give it a little squeeze in the corner. Squeeze in the corner and push off. There's the clip. And then you can install that to get the more rounded look, which would be perfect for a case fan. But for optimal pressure performance for a radiator, you're going to want this square bracket again. And I will say that the edges of this are not quite a gasket, like the Noctua cells, but it should be adequate. I would like to see Be Quiet sell a gasket that you could kind of put over this so that you would guarantee a really good seal for your radiator. It would just improve performance by a little bit more percent and guarantee no air kind of washed out the sides, but it's probably a non-issue. Let's see, on the back we have the manual tab adjusters. Again, my testing is all going to be in the UHS mode, and the RPM scaling is just going to be that. So you'll have to read between the lines for the different percentages. So from like 60-50, 70-80, depending on the RPMs of the fans itself. But I should be covering all the RPMs. I will be covering all the RPMs that the fan itself can perform at. All right, we already looked at the product page for the other one. It's the same product page, so let's look at the test data. All right, I have a few thoughts about the Fractal Design fans that come with the Torrent case. So personally, I wouldn't buy these fans outside the case. To me, their value is, this one is around maybe $15 to $20. I need to check Amazon what its retail price is. I'll have it linked down below. But I wouldn't pay more than that as compared to like the Noctool ones. It's just a little bit noisier. It's a pretty good fan. And this one I think is a like $40 to $50 fan, and that's pretty expensive. So two of these fans make up half, 2/3 the cost of the Torrent PC case. It is a pretty rare size. There aren't that many 18-inch fans on the market, but like it doesn't have 0 RPM, which is kind of fine for actually a case fan, but just feels expensive for what it is. But it moves a lot of air, and it's a pretty good fan. All right, before we take a look at individual graphs, let's get my data points. So the first one up here is for the Cougar, the same fan as on one of my other tests, the CF-V12HP, which is unfortunately no longer available. But this first graph is for two fans running in parallel through my case in the case simulated. So it's just airspeed testing. And I wanted to take a look at how two fans acted differently than just one fan. So we're going to take a look at those data points in some of the graphs. But here's the data, so you can record it if you want. Let's move on to the next one. The next one here is for the Be Quiet Silent Wings 4 Pro. I wrote it as Pro 4, 120 millimeter size fan. You'll notice that in this fan, I did it in 5% increments after 30. And that's because I wanted to have comparative results for the, to show RPMs for the Silent Wings 4 regular and the high speed, which had different RPMs. So I wanted to be able to line up closely with those so that you could use the same data for those fans as well, because they have the exact same blade design, just have a more limited maximum RPM. And they don't come with a special bracket frame. So they're more like case fans or CPU air coolers than like a pressure optimized radiator cooler. Right, and here's the data for the 140 millimeter size of the exact same fan. I'll leave it up. You can pause the video and take down the data if you want. Okay, we're going to take a look at the next fan. The next one here is the Fractal Design XGP18. So this is a 180 millimeter fan that's featured in the Torrent case. I believe all the Torrent case series. It's the big fan at the front. And you'll notice that it doesn't have CFM or airspeed through the air cooler because, well, the fan is absolutely massive and would not fit on the air cooler. Pause it and take down the data if you want. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the last fan. And the last fan in this roundup is the Fractal Design X2 GP14. That's the 140 millimeter fan in this testing. And go ahead and pause the video if you want to take down the data. Otherwise, we're going to keep it moving. Next, we're going to look at the individual graphs for the fans. This first one is two of the CF-V12HP, the Cougar fan, and the first graph here is the different color lines represent different distances from the fan, and the vertical axis is RPM, the horizontal is airspeed. The next graph here, again for the two Cougar fans, is distance in the horizontal and airspeed on the vertical at selected RPMs. And what we can see here is a relatively little drop in airspeed across all distances. And that is because there are more fans pushing more air, basically filling my case simulation full of air. So basically what does that mean? The more fans you have pushing air through the front, and this also is sort of the same with larger diameter fans, the less the airspeed will drop over the course of the case, because the whole case is filled with air and it's basically has less room for the air to spread out. So each fan helps fill in the gaps in the airflow. All right, taking a look at some more individual graphs. This one is for the Silent Wings 4 Pro 120 millimeter size fan. All right. Relatively linear air speeds as RPM increases. That makes a lot of sense. You can see that there's a huge jump in performance, particularly at the highest RPMs, as you go from, a huge jump in airspeed performance as you go from the 14-inch to the 11-inch, and then less of a jump between like the next three, and everything condenses towards the bottom. So looking at specific RPMs, bottom axis is again distance, the vertical is airspeed, specific RPMs, different colors. You can see that there's a pretty large increase in performance at the top end, and pretty evenly spaced, and again, you want more linear is better. And the next one is airspeed through a cooler. This one is pretty linear, which is good. That's what we're looking for. That basically just indicates that airspeed is dropping relatively consistently through the cooler at the very start, as RPM changes. This last graph for the 4 Pro Silent Wings 120 size, we have cubic feet per minute versus RPM, RPM vertical, cubic feet per minute horizontal, and we can see that the 4 Pro 120 does outperform my average fan throughout most of the curve. Mind, the maximum RPM of my quote-unquote average fan is under the maximum that the Silent Wings 4 can achieve. But if you take a look at the data point around 2100, 2200, you get to see where it performs, which is where I think the 4 regular, Silent Wings 4 regular fan sits. This is the various distances from the fan, RPM versus airspeed. For the Pro 4 140 millimeter size. Then we have the various RPMs, distance from the fan, airspeed vertical, and we can see pretty flat lines. It is a 140 millimeter fan, so it is filling more of that case, more like a bigger diameter fan, like the 180, or 2 fans, but not quite the same level. It still has a bit of a drop off towards the farthest parts of the case. And then we have the airspeed through a cooler, very linear looking line. And last but certainly not least for this one, we have CFM versus RPM, and it completely outperforms the average fan. But as I test more 140 millimeter fans, I'm going to be splitting up this line, my composite average fan, between 140 and 120s, because the diameter of my test, basically tube, is different for the two. So take all that with a grain of salt right there. All right, then we got the various distances in different colors versus RPM airspeed for the X2 GP18. So this is a 180 millimeter size fan. You can see that they're fairly closely packed because there's relatively little difference in airspeed between the different RPMs, basically. And then we have distance from the fan versus RPM. So the RPM, so the different colors. Horizontal distance, vertical is airspeed. It's very flat with a relatively low drop, which makes a lot of sense because the 180 millimeter size fan basically fills the box with air. So it's almost like a CFM test for that size fan, while for the smaller fans, it wouldn't be fair to do a CFM test here. As a quick note, I'm well aware that I had meters per second and CFM, and those are 2 different units, cubic feet per minute and meters per second. I applied conversions to my calculations. You can convert it to whatever you need it to be in whatever units you like to think in. I like to think volumetric flow rate and cubic feet per minute. And I decided that I'd rather do my airspeed measurements in meters per second, keeping it in metric. So I'm well aware of the crossed units going on. Here we have the Fractal Design X2GP14. That's a 140 millimeter fan. Sorry, I'm talking a little bit quick to get through it and move on to the combined graphs. So at the farthest distance, you see that it's very different across all RPMs than once you hit the 11-inch mark. This indicates that it does pretty well at keeping the air focused until sort of towards the end of the case where it's finally dispersed everywhere. And we can see that in more detail on the next graph, which is distance from the fan for an airspeed versus distance. And each of the line colors here are RPM. And you can see that it drops off heavily right at the end, while it stays pretty flat overall until towards the end. And at the slowest RPM, it's basically a flat line. It's just kind of moving a steady waft of air through the case. Then we have RPM versus airspeed through an air cooler. It's a very flat looking line, although it is a polynomial. If you're really interested, I can create another video showing the actual equation that it generated for this, just in Excel. Anyways, let's keep things moving. And here we have, again, this is an average fan. This is our GP14, and it completely blows an average fan out of the water. But again, my average fan is just that, it's an average fan. And as I do more 140 millimeter fans, this is going to be split up for 120s and 140s as the testing apparatuses are different. Before we start talking about the graphs, this set of data is more complicated as I have three essentially test scenarios. I have a 180 millimeter fan, I have 140 millimeter fans, and I have two fans running through the case. So some of these graphs are not directly comparable with each other. So they're split up into multiple charts. So bear with me as we're sorting our way through it. In noise normalized testing, I chose a reading of 42 decibels as my test criteria. This was because in my old case, I had, through an AIO, I had the Noctua NF-A12X25, and I know what RPM I found it fairly silent at. So I chose the closest decibel reading to that RPM as my baseline. So all of that out of the way, in noise normalized testing through an air cooler, the winner is the SilentWings 4 Pro 120 millimeter size fan. It has an RPM of 1,535 with an airspeed of 1.15. The second place goes to the 140 millimeter size Fractal Design X2 GP14, which had an RPM of 1,175 and an airspeed of 0.95. The Pro 140 millimeter size fan from SilentWings was very, very underperformed here. It only had an airspeed of 0.65. In the case testing, we have the SilentWings 4 Pro 120 and the Fractal Design X2 GP as the top performers again. The X2 GP14 had an RPM of 1,165 and the SilentWings 4 had an RPM of 1,535. The SilentWings 4 Pro 140 did a little bit better towards the end of the case, so farther away from the fan, where it outperformed the other two fans at an RPM of 950. Is still the case testing, but I also compared 180 to 120s, and I have a couple 140 up. So in this red line represents two 120 millimeter fans, and they ran at 1,060 RPM. The green line right here kind of bogged down with the average fan right there, that bottom curve, was one of those two fans that were running in parallel, and it was running at 1,128. Again, this is noise normalized. Then this blue line right here that I'm tracing is one SilentWings 4 Pro 140 millimeter size fan. And this blue line right here is the 180 millimeter size fan. So you can really see the advantage of having two fans versus one 140 versus one 180, all noise normalized. Two 120s are just superior. As a second note here, we are looking for the flattest line, so that's the least amount of change in airspeed. So the flattest line does appear to be the 180 or two 120s, which indicates that they're not losing much airspeed through the case. Next, we're taking a look at 100% RPM, the fans through a cooler. The SilentWings 4 Pro 120 is again the best at 2,830 RPM, with the other fans trailing pretty significantly behind it. It has an airspeed of 2.4 meters per second. The 140 millimeter version of the SilentWings 4 was at 2.06, with the X2 GP Fractal Design 140 trailing pretty far behind, but hitting about the average fan through the air cooler in meters per second, with the average fan being at 1.6 meters per second. At 100% RPM airflow through the case, the SilentWings 4 Pro 140 millimeter size fan is the top performer at all distances for the fans listed. So this is the 140 Fractal Design, the 120 SilentWings 4, the 140 SilentWings 4, with the average fan listed on the bottom. And you can see that the 120 millimeter size fan, SilentWings 4, does tend to drop off a little bit quicker towards the end than the 140 millimeter size one. And the 140 millimeter size Fractal Design drops off kind of steeply towards the end, but overall still performs very well. And a couple key notes: the Fractal had an RPM of 1,690 with an airspeed of 50.5. The SilentWings 4 Pro 440 has an RPM of 2,436 with a decibel reading of 61.5, so it's very noisy. And the Pro 4 Pro 120 has an RPM of 2,930 with a decibel reading of 53.4. When we take a look at the other scenario, so that's two fans and the 180, we get some pretty interesting results. The SilentWings 4 Pro 140 millimeter size fan is the best performer until you hit towards the end of the case, where the SilentWings, where the X2 GP18, that's 100 millimeter size fan, outperforms it because it can just move more air. The two fans in parallel versus one fan indicates some pretty interesting results. So one fan by itself is fairly linear drop in airspeed across the distance, while the two fans tends to level out a little bit towards the back of the case because it's filled the case with air and it just is pushing it kind of all through, while it has a pretty steady drop throughout most of the case until towards the back. With the average composite fan listed right here in blue. So all these fans outperform my composite average fan. Noise-wise, the 180 millimeter fan ran at 1,090 RPM with a decibel reading of 66 decibels, while the 4 Pro 140 ran at 2,436 RPM and a decibel reading of 61.5. As for two fans versus one fan, they had similar results in terms of noise and RPM. So 1,540 at 49 decibels, 1,590 at 49 decibels, two fans, one fan, respectively. Next up are the CFM charts. The first one is noise normalized. I have a composite fan average listed at the bottom. As I test more fans, that average will move. I hope to have two set averages, one for 140s, one for 120s in the future as I test more 140 millimeter size fans. Unfortunately, I just don't have a big enough data set for it yet. So, all of that being said, all the fans performed above average at 100 at noise normalized levels, with the top performer being the SilentWings 4 Pro 140. Mind the way in which it's the tube diameter for 140s and 120s are different. So looking at only 120s, the top performer, well, there's only one 120 on this graph. So the Silent Wings 4 Pro 120 performed well above the average fan with a air CFM cubic feet per minute, 53.25. Looking between the two 140 millimeter size fans, the Silent Wings 4 Pro 140 does outperform the Fractal Design X2 GP14, but both of them have very good results. Allowing the fans to stretch their proverbial legs at 100% fan speed, the CFM values are as follows. For 140 millimeter size fans, the 4 Pro had a CFM of 150.7. That is a huge number. The Fractal Design is just left far behind, but if you look at the RPMs, they are significantly different, so it's no surprise at all. All three fans completely outperform my average fan, and the Silent Wings 4 Pro 120 has very good results, so I think I could recommend it. Now let's take a look at noise profiles of these fans. The first chart here, we have the Silent Wings 4 Pro 120 size fan is the best for most RPMs, but the Fractal Design X2 GP14 is very impressive, particularly at low RPMs. So right here is my composite average fan. Right there, this brown line. It's not letting me, it's click. There we go. And at lower RPMs, this is the Fractal. It completely outperforms it. But the Silent Wings 4 Pro does particularly well until we get to the higher RPMs where it sort of matches, but is at a much higher RPM. And the 4 Pro 140 millimeter size fan is pretty significantly noisier than my average fan. On this last graph, we have the two fans in parallel. Right here, this red line. We have the 180 millimeter size fan. We have one 120, so same as the two fans in parallel, just one of them. And we have the Silent Wings 4 Pro 140 millimeter size fan, just as another point of reference. And we can see that the 180 millimeter size fan is significantly noisier, like very noisy, in fact, compared to the other fans. But you could probably run it at its minimum RPM and it would do just fine, moving pretty good amount of air through a case, particularly in the Fractal Design Torrent, where you got two of them. And taking a look at two fans versus one fan, you can particularly see why two fans is not too much worse than just having one fan, as it isn't that much noisier. And actually, if you look at it compared to an average fan, it only is a little bit noisier, and it actually sort of matches the line at 100% RPMs. RPM for two fans versus one. So it's kind of a no-brainer to have more than one fan in your case. It's just a validation test. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at some product pages for the different primary fans in this test, and then we'll go from there. The Be Quiet Silent Wings 4 Pro 120 millimeter size fan. .100% fan RPM. Be Quiet Silent Wings 4 Pro 140 millimeter size fan. This is the bottom case fan in the Fractal Design Torrent. It's the X2GP14, a 14-inch fan. Here it is in the test apparatus. There we go. Okay. And its sound profile. This fan at 0% has a RPM of around 300, just like the other Fractal Design, so it'll always be on. This is the fan that comes with the Fractal Design Torrent case. It's labeled as the X2GP1B, and it's a 180 millimeter fan, I believe. And let's see its noise profile at 100%. A side note about this fan, at a percent of 0, its RPM is around 300, so it never completely turns off, and it doesn't scale linearly with sound as the RPM goes over, what was it again, around 70 and higher. The sound profile doesn't really increase that much. But this could also be my test equipment and how close my microphone is to this, so that it's primarily just picking up the fan sound, not my room sound. Two Cougar CFV 12 HP fans for comparison testing versus one fan versus two for airflow through my wind speed test apparatus. That was the noise profile. On to the conclusion. So I'm sorry I don't have the Fractal Design X2 GP series fans in basically camera view. They have gone back and are installed in my case again. So I just have the two silent wings here. So after taking a look at all the data, what do I think about the different fans in this roundup? Well, the silent wings for 120 millimeter, particularly the Pro version, was incredibly impressive, particularly in noise normalized testing. It is hands down the best one in this group, and I highly recommend it. The X2 GP14, the 140 millimeter fan that comes in the Torrent case, is also fairly impressive. The silent wings for 140 millimeter just was a bit too noisy in the noise normalized testing. Once we open things up and look at 100% fan speeds and full noise basically, then really these two fans are the top performers. They both stand out as really good. But once again, the top performer that I'd really recommend is the 120 millimeter size fan. You just don't sacrifice as much noise. And I think a lot of that has to do with how thick the blades are. They're fairly thin, and I think that there's just more flex going on at the 140 millimeter size. Mind it moves a lot of air, but it just seems to be noisier than the 120 millimeter version. So there we have it. The silent wings for Pro series from Be Quiet, as well as taking a look at some of the other case fans. Definitely highly recommend this. A little bit more hesitant on this one, but I think if in whichever one you chose, you'd be happy with it. And thank you very much for watching. Subscribe for more content. I plan more fan testing in the future. Let me know in the comments down below which fans you want me to take a look at, which ones are of interest. I'd really like to know what people would like me to test out. Anyways, thank you very much for watching and have a great day.